Oh yeah, baby. We're in HD now. And now that we're in HD, I'd like to continue the discussion that I had begun in the previous two videos of Michael Allen Gillespie's book, The Theological Origins of Modernity, and here it is once again. And today, I'm going to be discussing in more detail the Renaissance, and all of those thinkers which had been influenced by Petrarch. And that means that I'm going to be discussing first the Italian Renaissance, which was more extreme, more Pelagian, more Promethean in its emphasis on the power and the capabilities and the potentialities of the human will, and also then Northern Humanism, which in most ways was more moderate and which stressed a more sort of inward and contemplative kind of religion as being the important thing. Now, before getting into a discussion of these two strands of thought, let's just do a quick recap about Petrarch and what I discussed about him and his ideas in the previous video. So, in the previous video, I discussed Francesco Petrarch, who was an Italian poet and who was a contemporary of William of Ockham's, because he had spent a considerable portion of his life in Avignon, which was at that time, around the early 14th century, the center of intellectual life in Western Christendom. He was acquainted with the thought of William of Ockham and other nominalists. And nominalism had sort of brought about, or really, I guess you could say, crystallized a crisis within Western Christendom. It had completely shattered the old foundations, the old sort of intellectual and theological foundations that scholasticism, with its realism about universals, had created from medieval thought. And the nominalists destroyed this utterly. They rejected the reality of universals and posited a radically omnipotent God, one that was not bound to keep his promises, one that had no fixed nature of any kind, one that was just pure, utter, untrammeled, undiluted will. And in the wake of such a concept of God, salvation became very precarious. It was difficult to know whether what one was doing would earn one's salvation or not. The idea began to emerge that nothing one really did could really merit salvation in any ultimate sense, because God was not obliged to save anybody. He could choose to save whoever he wanted to save and not save whoever he didn't want to save. Now, this notion of God, as it became ascendant, produced tremendous anxiety within Europe for obvious reasons. You have this radically omnipotent, distant God whose ways are impossible to understand, and no one really knew what it is that one could do to merit salvation. Now, it's true that the nominalists themselves tried to moderate this. They were probabilists about God and his will, and said, listen, if you be good, if you behave the right way, he'll probably save you. They tried to wiggle out of it that way, but the implications of their thinking was clear. And so along comes Petrarch in his effort to provide a new foundation for Western intellectual life and for thought, in order to replace the one that nominalism had destroyed. And in doing so, when it comes to thinking about the relation between man, God, and nature, Petrarch gave primacy to man. In doing so, he emphasized sort of having a private life in which one could look inside oneself, introspect, and discover what it was that one's nature demanded, and then live in such a way as to fulfill that nature, to fulfill one's potentialities, and so on. And another important feature of his thought was his interest in classical antiquity, specifically Roman moralists, people like Cicero, like Seneca, like the Stoics, although he was critical of the Stoics in many ways. But much of what he did ultimately led to a revival of classical thought and literature within Europe, because of his tremendous influence, those who followed him began emphasizing classical literature, classical thought, uh, Greek and Roman moralists and philosophers to a much greater degree than anyone had before. Now, because meaning Petrarch, had been influenced to such a great extent by Augustine, and the deeply introspective, contemplative nature of Augustine's Confessions, and also because of his love for classical literature in the classical world, Petrarch had set himself the project of trying to reconcile these two things together. He wanted to show how one could abide by at least some of the teachings of pagan moralists like Cicero, and yet still be legitimately considered a Christian. Now, he believed that the key to this was in the thought of Plato, and what led him to think this was, number one, Augustine's great emphasis on Plato and Neoplatonism, and the extent to which he drew on Plato, and also the extent to which Cicero drew on Plato. So you have these two thinkers, Augustine and Cicero, who greatly influenced Petrarch, and he saw that they both drew on Plato's work and decided, well, if pagan moralism and Christianity are to be reconciled, it is only through Plato that this can be done. Unfortunately for Petrarch, he didn't know Plato very well. The Platonic dialogues, although they had existed for a long time and had been studied by scholars for a long time in the Christian East, in the Byzantine Empire, had not quite penetrated the Christian West, really. All what was known about Platonism and Neoplatonism in the West at this time was sort of fragmentary, and so Petrarch himself didn't know much about Plato either, and was very limited in the extent to which he could accomplish this goal that he had set for himself. But even though he ultimately failed in this attempt at reconciling pagan virtue and Christianity by way of Platonism, and he admitted that he had really failed in this, he had set a project for many of those who were to follow him, and this really was, in many ways, the project that occupied the thinkers of the Italian Renaissance. Now, there is some debate among scholars going back for quite a long time about what exactly the Renaissance is. And Gillespie goes over some of the different viewpoints of the Renaissance, and I think it's worth going over them in just a little bit of detail as part of like a general series of remarks before I actually go into the meat of things and discuss specifically Italian humanism in detail and specifically Northern humanism. Now, there is a line of thought that wants to de-emphasize the role of Christianity within Italian humanism especially, and wants to trace its origins back to something else. Now, superficially, this seems like a plausible way to try and explain the Italian Renaissance, because, after all, you had this great emphasis on pagan thought, on pagan antiquity, a study of classical literature, learning Greek, Roman, Latin, learning these classical languages and really immersing oneself in the study of the classical world. And when one looks at this, one can certainly get the impression that Christianity had taken a back seat to a lot of this. This, although it seems superficially plausible, is ultimately mistaken, Gillespie argues, because all of these thinkers that I'm going to discuss, the Italian ones in particular, always considered themselves at the end of the day to be Christians, even if rather unconventional Christians. So one of probably the distinctive, really, characteristic of Italian humanism is its emphasis upon man as the imago Dei, as the image of God, as having been created in the image of God, and because he is so created, the Italian humanist thought, humans therefore partook of the divine essence. They shared in what it was to be God. They had a spark of divinity within them, and therefore the human will was capable of all sorts of great feats and all kinds of, Herculean and Promethean accomplishments. And you certainly see this line of thinking reflected in a lot of the scholars that came out of the Renaissance, right? They were proficient in multiple fields. You get the term Renaissance man having come out of this as someone who really has knowledge of everything, who is proficient in just about everything, who is multiply talented, and so on. So you have this emphasis on the human will in this way, but despite the Pelagian, even Promethean, and ultimately heretical leanings of this, it was still always in its intentions a Christian project, because the Italian humanists said that whatever man's greatness, whatever his powers may be, he only has them by virtue of the fact that he has been created in the image of God. And so all of his greatness, his potentialities, are really a divine gift. And so for all of their emphasis on the human will, they never really denied God's ultimate sovereignty. They never really took him out of a central position, although a superficial reading of their works can make it seem like they did. Now, that said, among those who wish to deny the Christian roots of Italian humanism, one of the attempts to explain Italian humanism has to do with a tradition within Italy of public speaking, of oratory, of great emphasis on rhetoric, and a sort of an education that emphasized things like grammar, language, and so on, that was intended to produce good orators. This tradition within Italy sort of predated humanism, and it's claimed that out of this tradition, Italian humanism, with its emphasis on rhetoric, on language, because it had similar areas of emphasis, it's out of this tradition that the Italian Renaissance emerged. And these classically trained orators were called dictatores. Now, it may seem, again, superficially plausible to locate the origins of Italian humanism within the dictatores tradition, but ultimately this sort of argument can't be sustained, because the dictatores really had no interest in classical antiquity as such. To the extent that they were interested in classical orators, it was only as a way of improving their own oratory and their own speaking skills. The humanists, on the other hand, were very much interested in the classical world for its own sake. They were interested in Roman virtue and its civic institutions and so on. So there was a much deeper interest among the humanists than among the dictatores in the classical world. So although you could say that there's some sort of continuity between the dictatores tradition and Italian humanism, it isn't correct to say that Italian humanism entirely originated out of this tradition. There is an undeniable sort of Christian component to this, because, as I said, despite its Pelagian and Promethean leanings, it was always thought of by the actual thinkers who were engaged in it as a Christian project. There's also another line of thought, going back to people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Jakob Burckhardt, that sees the Renaissance as sort of the first explosion or emergence or example of true modernity. And it sees the Italian Renaissance as being skeptical, as being at least anti-Christian, if not anti-religious, as greatly emphasizing pagan works and so on. But this also, for reasons I mentioned, cannot really be sustained. None of these thinkers, I mean, maybe Machiavelli, but even not really him, could even be plausibly called an atheist. They were all Christians, even if Christians of a somewhat unconventional sort. Another line of thought that Gillespie discusses is the claim that Italian humanism was really an outgrowth, or really could be ultimately reduced to, civic republicanism. and the emphasis on republican governmental structures as based on the old models of Roman antiquity, of the Roman Republic, and so on. And in arguing for this, you can point, for example, to Machiavelli, whose discourses outline a theory of republican government that's basically, built on the Roman model. He wanted to institute something like that in Florence. Now he's also remembered for The Prince, but there's that other work, The Discourses, that gives this sort of republican theory. There are also writers like Quentin Skinner who want to trace the origins of Anglo-American democracy and republicanism to this tradition within the Renaissance and within civic humanism, particularly Florentine republicanism. Now, among those who want to reduce Italian humanism entirely to civic republicanism, probably the chief of these thinkers is someone named Hans Baron, who wrote a book named The Crisis of the Early Italian Renaissance, and he tries to do exactly what I described, to say that the essence of Italian humanism lay in civic republicanism. But as Gillespie says, this can't really be sustained because there are all these other factors within Italian humanism that sort of emphasis just doesn't take into account. Now, there's no doubt that civic humanism was a component of the humanist enterprise within Italy, but it was never really the principal component. And outside of Italy, civic republicanism had no presence at all. Now, what's interesting is that Gillespie says that it seems to him that Baron tried to argue for this because he wanted to provide a foundation for secular government that was different from the foundation given to it by people like John Locke and other natural rights theorists, because if you accept natural rights theory, you're then committed, Baron thought, to a relatively free capitalistic economy, and he didn't want that. So Baron probably, I don't know about him in too much detail, but he was probably some sort of extreme leftist or Marxist, and his sort of disdain for capitalism led him to postulate this alternate theory. But ultimately, theories that attempt to explain the Italian Renaissance as something distinct from or apart from Christianity cannot be sustained because there is an undeniably strong and important Christian component to the whole project, to the whole deal. Now, with these general remarks having been made, I can dive more deeply into Italian humanism first, and then after I complete that discussion, we'll go into Northern humanism. Although when I discuss Northern humanism, I'm really only going to be discussing Desiderius Erasmus, the Dutch thinker, because he was sort of far and away the most important of the Northern humanists. He's sort of emblematic of all the rest of them. He doesn't really differ too much from any of them, and once you get a grasp on his work and his thought, you can get yourself a nice epitome of what the Northern Renaissance was all about. But let's start with the Italian Renaissance. Now, the first thinker to consider was a man named Coluccio Salutati. He was born in 1341. He received the sort of typical education that a well-off Italian man would receive at the time. So he was trained more or less in classical rhetoric and in this sort of dictatores tradition that I described earlier, trained in grammar and languages and so on. What we today would call a humanistic education, an education in the humanities, although that term is obviously derived from humanism, so it would be anachronistic to apply it, but it's the same sort of thing. Now, in 1368, he begins a correspondence with Petrarch, and comes under Petrarch's influence by way of this correspondence. He also secures a job for himself as a papal secretary, but then in 1375, he leaves to go to Florence and basically gets the job of being Chancellor of Florence, and he works at that. Now, Salutati was primarily a statesman. He was primarily a politician, and therefore someone who primarily dealt in the active life. Remember Petrarch's distinction between the active life, where one is involved in politics and one is a public figure and so on, and then the contemplative life, where one sort of retreats to the privacy of solitude, to introspect, to uncover one's own individuality, and then to learn what it is that one must do in order to develop one's potentialities. Now, Salutati was a politician, so he primarily lived the sort of active life, and so it's sort of strange that he had come under the influence of Petrarch and sort of secured himself a position among important humanists. But despite his political career and his focus on that, he did manage to write two important treatises, one being called On Religion and Flight from the World, and the other called On Fate and Fortune. Now, in On Fate and Fortune, he essentially accepted a nominalistic picture of man as a primarily willing rather than a rational being. He also rejected Aristotelianism on basically nominalistic grounds. He thought, like the nominalists, that ontological individualism was the important thing, and to the extent that realism about universals, and therefore Aristotelianism, denied this, that it was wrong. However, he didn't completely agree with the nominalists on everything. He totally rejected their idea that because of God's supreme omnipotence, that there was nothing that one could really do to influence God to grant him salvation. He believed, nevertheless, that there was a place for the human will in the scheme of things here. And as such, he came under attack from really both sides of the realist nominalist debate. Dominicans, for example, really didn't like him. Gillespie mentions one Dominican writer in particular, Giovanni Dominici, who attacked him in print. But yeah, you have the start of this kind of emphasis on man as a primarily willing being, but as one who is able, by the strength of his will, to attain salvation. And from that comes an emphasis on man as being created in the image of God, as having a sort of divine spark in him, if you will. And that line of thought really continues and trickles down to further humanists. So another example would be someone like Leonardo Bruni, who in many ways had a very similar sort of background and career to that of Salutati. He was actually one of Salutati's students. Now, among Bruni's many achievements is that he, for one thing, eased a lot of the fear and apprehension that a lot of Christians had about the emphasis on pagan literature and classical thought that was emerging among this new generation of humanists, because he translated a letter written by Saint Basil, who was important in Christianity, where he basically encourages Christian students to study classical literature, to read Greek and Roman poets and so on, and by doing this and by sort of showing it to the world, he said, see, look, here's this Christian hero, this Christian saint, who says, look, reading pagan literature is important too, so it's not so bad that we're doing it. He also introduced, well, really popularized a concept of looking at history that was different from the one before it. The previous way that one had looked at history within the medieval age was what you call a four empires theory. So world history was sort of divided into four different empires. So those were the Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek, and the Roman. That was the old sort of theory of history, the way to frame historical narratives. Bruni did away with this and popularized the sort of three ages theory of history, I guess you could call it that. So this divided a history into an ancient period, into a middle age, kind of medieval period, and then the modern age, which is sort of more or less, I'm painting with a broad brush here. This is obviously, I'm saying this obviously in broad strokes, but in a broad sense, this is more or less the sort of way that we look at history now. We see the ancient world, and then the Middle Ages, and then the modern period to which we today feel some connection. Now, this notion was obviously influenced by Petrarch's idea that he stood at the end of a dark age, because Petrarch saw himself as sort of reviving classical antiquity and bringing Roman virtue back to the fore, as I said. So he saw his time as kind of a dark age, and that he stood at the end of that, and that it was his responsibility to inaugurate something new and better. So Bruni took that from Petrarch. Another one of his accomplishments is that he finally began the process of translating Platonic dialogues into Latin and introducing them to a Western audience. However, his translations were not very accurate. Another humanist to discuss who is important is Lorenzo Valla. Now, Lorenzo Valla was what's called a Christian hedonist. Now, you may remember from the previous videos where I explained what hedonism means within a philosophical context. It's basically the view that the most important thing in life, the purpose of life, is pleasure. Now, how is this to be reconciled with Christianity? Well, Valla wrote a work called On Pleasure, which was basically a dialogue between a Stoic, an Epicurean, and a Christian hedonist. And what he says is that, well, beatitude, meaning union with God, since beatitude is the highest, the supreme, the greatest pleasure that one could possibly experience, then in being Christian and in pursuing beatitude, one is ultimately being a hedonist, and so in that way the two views are compatible. Another thing for which Valla is famous is that he used his classical kind of humanistic training in rhetoric, in linguistics, in classical languages, in philology, and so on, to demonstrate that a certain very important document, the donation of Constantine, was actually a forgery. Valla demonstrated this in 1440, although, as I found out later, there have been people for centuries before Valla who suspected that the document might be a forgery. It was Valla who finally proved this beyond reasonable peradventure or doubt. Now, the donation of Constantine, for those who don't know, was a document that basically established the temporal power of the papacy. It was a document which claimed that Constantine, the old Roman emperor, had ceded to the Pope temporal authority over the city of Rome. So this was supposed to justify the temporal, political, earthly power of the church. When Valla demonstrated this to be a forgery, he weakened the power of the church, obviously, in so doing. However, I should say that his having done this was not viewed as something anti-Christian, even at the time. Indeed, later in 1448, he was given a position as a papal secretary precisely because of his linguistic and philological skills. Those things were considered, very, very useful. So, another thing to discuss now is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, Petrarch had set the project for future humanists of trying to reconcile Christianity and Roman virtue by way of Platonism. Now, Plato was not particularly well known among Western Christians, but this was slowly changing because the emphasis that the humanists placed on the classical world was starting to bring all of these things and all of this literature into contact with the Christian West, and they gave it a tremendous emphasis. This included, of course, learning Greek and eventually, translating the Platonic dialogues into Latin, which, as I said, Bruni tried to do, although not particularly well. Although happily things did get better. When this really accelerated was when Western Christendom finally came into contact with Eastern Christendom. And in Eastern Christendom, Plato had always been there. He'd always been known to Eastern Christians because of the isolation between East and West and lack of interaction between the two. Uh, Plato had never sort of become as popular and as well known in the West as he had been in the East. But during the Council of Ferrara, which lasted from 1438 to 1445. My memory still works. That's good. Um, in this council, many of the Italian humanists came into contact for the first time with Byzantine thinkers. And the two most important among them were Gemistus Pletho and then his student John Bessarion. They were these sort of Eastern Christian philosophers, theologians, mystics, and so on. And a lot of their work was deeply centered around Christianity, around Neoplatonism, and they also drew heavily on the early church fathers like Saint Athanasius, Gregory of Nyssa, Oration, who had all also made heavy use of Neoplatonism. So, in coming into contact with these two thinkers, the popularity of Plato had exploded in the West as a result. Now, prior to this, Plato was not well known, but this really changed. And it was after this that Petrarch's original project of trying to reconcile Roman morality and Roman virtue with Christianity really took off. And it is with the thought of Marsilio Ficino that Platonism really became the beating heart, the lifeblood of the Italian humanist project. Ficino lived from 1433 to 1499. He was, like many of the Italian thinkers of his age, multi-talented, skilled in many different fields. So in addition to being a philosopher and a theologian, he was also ordained as a priest. He was a doctor. He was a musician, and so on. Just multiply talented person. And he had sort of gathered a group of humanists and thinkers around himself, and they met regularly at his villa in Florence to discuss Plato, to discuss the works of various classical writers, to share their ideas and so on. And he'd sort of formed this informal discussion group. And there were many famous humanists and artists that were part of this group. So Michelangelo attended the meetings, Raphael, Titian, Pico della Mirandola, who I will discuss later, Lorenzo de' Medici was there. Many important figures of the Italian Renaissance had gathered around Ficino, and he had become this sort of guru, and he'd influenced many of them. Now, as I said, Platonism really was at the core of Ficino's thought. And as he learned more about Plato and read more about Plato, he became convinced that yes, if a reconciliation between Roman morality and Christianity can be made, it is only through Platonism that this can happen. Now, as he read Plato, and by the way, as he learned about these things, it all sort of happened more or less by chance almost, because in 1462, Lorenzo de' Medici gave him a series of texts to translate. These included a few Platonic dialogues, but they also included things like the Corpus Hermeticum, which was a series of texts attributed to an ancient figure called Hermes Trismegistus. And these writings really form the core of Hermeticism. So, as he was translating these works, he noticed that there were similarities between the creation story in Genesis, the creation story that Plato gave in his work, the Timaeus, and then the creation story in the Chaldean or in the Corpus Hermeticum. He also examined something called the Chaldean oracles, which were at that time attributed to Zoroaster. and he noticed similarities between all of these things, and he ultimately concluded that all of these things, all of these stories, all of these lines of thought had a common origin, and he decided ultimately that the figure that originated all of these things was Hermes Trismegistus. So Hermeticism was the ultimate source of Christianity, of Judaism, of Platonism, and therefore of all Greek philosophical thought, of a lot of Zoroastrianism. He believed that there was this primeval, super ancient Hermetic tradition that was the origin of all of these things. And this is actually one of the ways that humanists ultimately jumped on to try and reconcile Roman virtue with Christian thought. One way, and a less popular way, was to look at what St. Paul had said in one of his letters about God's will being revealed in nature and in the laws of nature, and saying that to the extent that virtuous pagans had lived their lives according to nature, they had, even if unknowingly and unwittingly, worshipped the true God, and so therefore you could sort of finagle these two things and sort of reconcile them. But the more popular way was the one taken up by Ficino, which claimed that Greek thought and Christianity had a common origin within Hermeticism. Now, I should pause here to note that nobody believes in this anymore, at least not among serious scholars. Like, if you want to talk about influences that permeate down to this day, you do have sort of esotericists and hermeticists, Rosicrucians and occultists today who still accept this notion of an ancient Hermetic tradition. But this started in the Italian Renaissance among thinkers like Ficino. Now today we know that the Corpus Hermeticum is not something super ancient that dates back to before Moses, which is what Ficino believed, but it's actually something that was written sometime between the 1st and the 3rd centuries CE. So it may even have originated after Christianity, or at least been roughly contemporaneous with Christianity. So, as I said, scholars, like serious scholars who've investigated this, don't believe in a literal super ancient Hermetic tradition. By the way, I learned this from another book that I'd read by a historian of science named Peter Harrison. But the person who finally exposed this as being the case, as there really having been no ancient Hermetic tradition, was someone named Isaac Casaubon, who during his time in the 16th century was considered the most learned man in all of Europe. He was a true polymath, skilled in every field, knew virtually everything about everything that there was to know at the time, widely renowned for his erudition, and he was the one who in 1614 really showed convincingly and conclusively that there was no ancient Hermetic tradition, and the Corpus Hermeticum was probably written sometime between the 1st and the 3rd centuries CE. Now, however, Ficino and those around him had no way of knowing this. So they believed that Hermes Trismegistus had taught Moses, and that he had also taught Orpheus, and then Orpheus would go on later to teach other Greeks, and then their knowledge would be imparted to Pythagoras, and then to Plato. And so Hermes Trismegistus was believed to be this kind of ultimate source of ancient wisdom and knowledge. And this led Ficino on a path to try and reconcile virtually all religious traditions, whether they be Greek, Christian, Zoroastrian, Jewish, you name it. He really attempted this project of syncretism, where you take all these ancient strands of religious and philosophical thought and show that really, despite appearances, they are all in harmony with one another, because he believed they ultimately derived from Hermeticism. And this is a project that really occupied the work of many Italian humanists, in particular Pico della Mirandola, who I'll discuss in a moment. But going into more detail about some of Ficino's thought, because he was a Platonist, he believed that there was a sort of divine principle inherent in all things that drew people naturally toward the good. And this is something that he derived out of Plato. One of the things that ultimately convinced him that Platonism and Christianity were compatible is the emphasis that one finds in Plato's dialogues on the immortality of the soul. And he thought, well, this is consistent with Christianity saying that man is created in the image of God. Actually, it was Ficino's writings that ultimately influenced the church later in 1512, a little while after he died, to make the claim that the soul is immortal a part of Christian doctrine. So this was proclaimed at a council as, sort of being ex cathedra and true Christian doctrine, but it was Ficino that played an important influence in this. So, going back to some of his thought, he believed that there was a divine principle in things that made everything tend toward the good. But having read Augustine and being familiar with some of the Neoplatonists, this is meaning people like Plotinus, Proclus, Porphyry, whose works he translated into Latin, by the way. Being familiar with these works, he realized, agreeing with Plotinus and then with Augustine, that God not only must have the capacity to love, but actually, in a deeper sense, must be love. And the reason for this is that it is only if God is love, so he thought, and he got this from Plotinus and Augustine, it is only if God is love that one can reconcile and solve the problem of the one and the many within the divine being. What is the problem of the one and the many? This is basically, this is one of the most ancient problems in all of philosophy. It's basically the idea that for anything that we could talk about, for anything that we could describe, there seems to be a way of viewing it from the perspective of seeing it as one kind of whole, and then seeing it as many sort of distinct parts. And these two perspectives often seem to be contradictory, and yet they both seem to be valid. So the problem is there some way of reconciling these two perspectives? That's, in a very broad and general sense, the problem of the one and the many. So just to give an example, just off the top of my head, you can view a human society as being one thing, as being a society. So you can see something as a country, like Germany or Australia, let's say. And that society, as a society, has its own peculiar characteristics that it and only it has, things that distinguish it. And yet, you could also view that society from the perspective of the many. You can see it as a collection of many individuals, each with their diverse goals, desires, values, etc. And there seems to be a degree of truth in both of these perspectives. So that's one kind of example of the problem of the one and the many appearing somewhere. Now, the problem of the one and the many as it concerned divine being really was something that came out of Trinitarian theology. Now, in Neoplatonist thought, the source of all being, the source of all existence, the ultimate source of everything that is, was referred to as the One. Now, the One, as the name suggests, was one thing. He was completely undivided. No distinctions exist within the One. The One is ultimately metaphysically simple. He has no parts whatsoever like you and I have parts. So, you have a head, you have hands, you have fingers, and these are the parts that make you up. The One, in Neoplatonism, in Plotinus' thought in particular, had no parts. And he had no parts because as the source of all being, as the ultimate source of all existence, he had to be ultimately simple. And yet, in Christian theology, in Trinitarian theology, there are three parts to God's essence. So you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So how is it that one can view God as being one? And the Christians, early Christians, were heavily influenced by Neoplatonism, so they took Plotinus' notion of the one, and of the one being ultimately mereologically and metaphysically simple, and said, well, that must be what God is. As the source of all being, he must be one. He must be so simple that he does not even allow within himself for a distinction between his essence and his existence. There are no distinctions between his properties, and it's only because of our finite perspective that it seems so, they would say. So God has properties like, you know, omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and so on. But within God, it was said among these early Christians, and this was a metaphysical tradition that carried on for quite a bit. I mean, Thomas Aquinas said the same thing. That these properties, although they would be distinct in any creature, in any created thing that had them, they're not distinct in God. So ultimately, because God is simple, his omniscience is his omnipotence, which is his omnibenevolence, which is his aseity, which is his impassibility, and so on. So all of the divine attributes, because God was simple, were thought to collapse into one thing. So given that God is one in this way, and also given that Trinitarian theology says that he is many, how can you reconcile these things? So you have an example of the problem of the one and the many coming up. And what Augustine believed was that this could only be reconciled if one saw God as being love in some ultimate sense. Ficino took this up. So, since God is love, and this is going on with Ficino's thought now, since God is love, and since God is the source of all beings, since all things come from God, since everything that exists because God has donated being to it, it must be the case then that everything has love within it in some sense, and that this love operates within it and drives it towards the good, and therefore drives it towards God. Right? So, because humans are created in the image of God, and because they have a divine essence within them, their natural inclinations lead them toward God. That sort of love is natural within them, and that it propels them toward divinity. Now, when he says love, he means love in the broadest possible sense. He's actually using love in the sense that Plato used it in his dialogue, the Symposium. Now, so this could mean something like romantic or sexual love, but it goes far beyond that. It includes all forms of love whatsoever. So all sort of natural inclinations within humans, because they are natural, lead one toward God and toward divinity, and therefore they're morally good things. That it's a good thing for one to follow one's own natural inclinations. And again, rather shockingly for the time, this led to the conclusion, according to Ficino, that, sexual desire was a good thing, and so on. It's upset a lot of monks, I'm sure. So Ficino discussed things like this in a lot of his works. On Love, which is one of his books, is probably regarded as the most important literary work of the Italian Renaissance. And it's really a sort of a commentary on Plato's Symposium. I think it was published in 1466. He also wrote, and this is probably his greatest work, it's called Platonic Theology, where he sort of sets out all of these ideas that humans being created in the image of God are naturally attracted towards God and therefore towards the good, and that love is operative within them and therefore within the whole world, etc., etc. This whole thing is sort of spelled out and elaborated in much more detail. I'd actually been wanting to read Ficino's work for a long time. I finally ordered the first volume of Platonic Theology. It's coming in the mail. I should have it soon. And that would be interesting to read. But that's sort of a broad kind of taste of Ficino's views. Now, going back to Lorenzo Valla for a moment, because he had, like many of the other humanists, begun to take an interest in Plato, he had begun to see not only man as primarily willing, but also God, and he inherited this from the nominalists as well. But taking from Plato, he took from Plato this notion of God as artificer, as artisan, that he created the world in a way that was analogous to the way in which an artisan or an artist creates things. And so one of the interesting conclusions that Valla reached in his thought, and this had an enormous influence on all subsequent Renaissance art, was that when one creates art, one participates in the divine being because one exercises one's creativity. Now, since humans are finite, they cannot create in the same way that God creates. God creates ex nihilo. He creates from nothing. Humans can only create by making use of previously existing materials. And so when humans create, what happens is that they participate in the divine essence, and they, so to speak, re-will what God has willed. They recreate what God has created. And so Valla reached the conclusion that the purpose of art was to re-will that which God has done, to recreate the divine essence that existed in all things throughout the world and to sort of redepict them. He actually sort of saw religion in this way. He said that because religion is ultimately mediated by language, and because all religious ideas and really all ideas whatsoever are expressed within language, and because language is a human construct, and this is something, by the way, that he also took from Plato. Plato rejected the idea of a natural language. There were some people who thought that there was kind of a naturally existing language where words objectively correspond to certain things. Plato rejected this. He thought that language is a human creation. Valla took this on. And he therefore reached the conclusion that when one uses language, and one has to use language in all thinking whatsoever, one, in a sense, re-wills that which God has already willed. And so the interesting thing is that he took thought, he took thinking, philosophizing, and all of those sorts of things, and he changed them from being what they had been for medieval thinkers, which is a rational activity, to being something that the will does. So thinking is no longer an act of reason, it's an act of will. That's a very interesting sort of transition. There's also another thing that Gillespie does not discuss in his book, but as far as drawing connections to later thinking and more contemporary thought is concerned, I thought this would be something interesting to explore. As I mentioned, Valla takes from Plato the idea of God as creating in a way analogous to that in which an artisan creates. Within Plato, there's also this idea of the demiurge, which is kind of like the most powerful of all the creatures. So going back to Neoplatonic thought, you have the one. But because the one is seen as ultimately metaphysically perfect and metaphysically simple, the one is in a sense limited by his own perfection. The one in Neoplatonism and Platonism really cannot interact with the world. The reason he cannot interact with the world is because the world is finite, right? Things pass away, things are transitory, everything is finite and limited in the world as we observe it, and the one is not like this. He's totally distinct from this, and there's therefore a gigantic metaphysical gulf that separates the world as it exists from the one. And so, in order to create the finite world and to do things in it, the one had to create the demiurge, which was a finite being, but was very powerful, and the one could sort of use the demiurge to enact his will. And from this, you get this notion within Plato of God as being like an artificer, as being sort of like a demiurge. Now, the reason I bring all of this up is that there are Christian philosophers today, Christian thinkers today, people like William Lane Craig, Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, for example, who, when they think of God and when they explain what they mean by God and what their concept of God is, they show that they have a notion of God that is very, very different from the idea of God present in most of Christian theology throughout most of its history. Now, throughout most of its history, um, Christian thinkers, Christian philosophers and theologians accepted something called the doctrine of divine simplicity, which again is this idea that God is ultimately metaphysically simple, that no distinctions exist within him, he has no parts, he's so simple and so much one that there is no distinction even between his essence and his existence. Now, thinkers like Craig, Plantinga, Swinburne, etc., they reject this. Now, if you want to describe these two different views with a kind of terminology, I'm borrowing this from Brian Davies, who's a philosopher within the Dominican order. He's a Christian philosopher of religion. And he calls the older tradition that accepts divine simplicity classical theism, and then the more modern, the more current position held by people like Plantinga, Craig, and Swinburne as theistic personalism. Now, the reason he calls it theistic personalism is that when someone like Plantinga, Craig, or Swinburne talks about God, they always make sure to describe God as being a person. Like, whenever, you see this over and over in Plantinga, for example, you ask him what is theism, and he always says, well, it's the belief that there is such a person as God. Right? So the primary thing for God within theistic personalism is personhood. God is a person. Whereas within classical theism, the primary attribute for God is that he is not contingent on anything. He is the source of all being. He is independent of all things. And the main thing about him is his necessity. But in order for him not to be dependent on anything, he must be ultimately simple. This is where the doctrine of simplicity comes from. So people like Craig, Swinburne, and Plantinga reject this because they think it's unintelligible for some reason. I've never really understood what their reasons are. When I've heard them try and criticize divine simplicity, I've always been left with the impression that they just don't understand it. But anyway, when they look at God, when someone like Craig, Plantinga, Swinburne, etc., looks at God, they see him as primarily a person. That is, a member of a class called persons. That is, God is an example of something called a person, and persons are a broader class of things, God being one of the things that fits into that class. Now, the problem for this from the classical perspective is that it makes the existence of this broader thing, the class, somehow metaphysically prior to God. But what classical theism emphasizes is that nothing can be metaphysically prior to God. So that's wrong. That can't be right. You see this also in the conclusion of Plantinga's modal ontological argument for the existence of God. The way he phrases his conclusion is that God exists in all possible worlds. A classical theist would not like that phrasing at all. A classical theist would say, look, if you say that God exists in all possible worlds, then you're making it seem as though abstract modal space, that is, imagine an abstract space and each point in the space is represented by a possible world. And by the way, for those who don't know, when philosophers speak of possible worlds, they just mean, a possible way in which the world could have been, as distinct from the way it actually happens to be in fact. So, there's a possible world where I'm 8 feet tall. There's a possible world where, all the best basketball players are Chinese, whatever. Anything you can imagine. If you could take sort of the abstract space where each point in the space represents a possible world, when Plantinga says God exists in all possible worlds, it means that God inhabits each point of that space. The problem with saying it that way for a classical theist is that it makes it seem as though that abstract space, modal space, is somehow metaphysically prior to God, but again, according to classical theism, nothing can be metaphysically prior to God. So a better way to phrase it for a classical theist would be not to say that God exists in all possible worlds, and that he exists necessarily, in that sense, but to say that no world could be possible apart from God's existence. That would be a more acceptable phrasing. Now, why did I take this long detour into obscure theological matters? I'm sort of speculating here. I think that the view of God as an artificer, as creating in a way analogous to the way in which an artisan creates, that Valla took up from Plato, may have ultimately influenced theistic personalism. Because theistic personalism has a completely different notion of divine action, of divine being, and so on, than classical theism has. And one of the critiques that classical theists offer of theistic personalists is that the way that they depict God isn't really God. It can't be God. It can't be the ultimate source of being that they're talking about. What they're talking about is actually more like a Platonic demiurge. And if Valla started thinking about God as analogous to an artificer, maybe that line of thought has some connection to what eventually became theistic personalism. I don't know. That's total speculation on my part, but it's an interesting sort of speculation. So, you have this idea from Ficino of, and this is again a recap because I've veered pretty far off course here, but don't worry, this is important. So you have this idea in Ficino that God is love, because that's how you reconcile the problem of the one and the many within the divine nature, and that therefore all created things have love existing as a principle within them, therefore allowing them to tend naturally towards the good and toward God. And you also have within people like Valla and the other humanists this notion of human creativity, artistic creativity, as in some sense being analogous to divine creativity. When one creates as an artist and when one attempts to depict the divinely beautiful essence of all things through art, one is re-willing what God has willed. One is sort of kind of elevating oneself to the status of something semi-godlike. Okay, so we see this whole line of thought. Now, this line of thought, as well as the syncretism that existed within the Italian Renaissance, meaning the idea that, the belief that all philosophical systems, that all religions really derive from the same source, and that they all could be reconciled with one another. All of these strands of thought in the Italian Renaissance reach their culmination in a thinker named Pico della Mirandola, and I actually have some of his works here. This says On the Dignity of Man here, but On the Dignity of Man was really, well, it was called an Oration on the Dignity of Man, and that's one of the works that Pico is responsible for. There are a few others contained in that book. There's an essay that he writes on the one and the many, in which he tries to reconcile the view of Plato and the view of Aristotle on the problem of the one and the many. He tries to argue that they ultimately have the same view, that their views are consistent with each other, even though most people believe that they were diametrically opposed, which again shows you this thing within the Italian Renaissance of trying to reconcile seemingly disparate traditions, this syncretism once again. So, but let's go back to his oration on the dignity of man. And by the way, before even going into that, Pico was again in many ways sort of emblematic of figures of the Italian Renaissance. He died very young. He lived from 1463 to 1494, so he died when he was 31. Despite his very short life, he was tremendously learned. Had a massive library, studied all sorts of things, all sorts of philosophical systems. He knew all sorts of languages. For example, he studied with the Jewish Averroist Elia de Medigo, and that sounds like a Spanish name, so he was probably some sort of Spanish rabbi. He studied with him. He learned Hebrew. He learned Arabic. He learned Greek. All sorts of things. And his knowledge of all of these different languages allowed him to refer to all sorts of different texts and try to bring them and all the things that they said together into one sort of coherent, overarching kind of master system. And in his work he attempted to do this. His ultimate attempt to do this really came out in his work which is called the 900 Theses, in which he basically took 900 different claims from all sorts of different religions, and he tried to reconcile them and show why they weren't really inconsistent with one another. Now, he ultimately failed in this project. It was a massive undertaking, extremely ambitious, but I'll get to that in a moment. First, I want to talk about his main and kind of most famous work, which is his Oration on the Dignity of Man. And to give you some idea of just like what a scholar Pico was, he wrote this when he was 23, okay, very young, and it was already tremendously learned even at this incredibly young age. He was a student of Ficino's also, so he took up a lot of Ficino's ideas and sort of continued them. But the basic idea of Pico's Oration on the Dignity of Man, and by the way, I'll just refer to him as Pico because his full name is Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. You cannot say that without the Italian inflection. It's sacrilegious to say a name like that without even trying to make your voice sound Italian, because that's just awesome name. Anyway, the della Mirandola part just means from Mirandola, because he was from a place called Mirandola. So his name, just as his name, is Giovanni Pico. So I'll be calling him Pico from now on. So the main idea of Pico's Oration on the Dignity of Man is that the reason why man is the most splendid of all the creatures, the most exalted of them, the most dignified of them, is that he is able to participate in the divine nature in some way. So again, you have this idea reiterated of a strong emphasis being placed on man as being created in the image of God. Now, what shows that man has been created in the image of God? What is the sign of the divine imprint on man? Well, Pico says that the sign of this is basically the fact that man has no fixed nature. So, not only does Pico accept the view that the nominalists and later a lot of the humanists took of man as being a primarily willing rather than a reasoning being, he goes further than this. He says, not only is man primarily a willing creature, but he is also a self-creating creature. He has no fixed nature. He can decide what he wants to be. He can mold himself into whatever he wishes. And that means that his potentialities are virtually unlimited. He can scale the very highest heights of everything. Master all sorts of different fields, all sorts of different arts, all sorts of different things, and really sort of elevate himself and achieve this kind of Promethean sort of greatness, which is what he basically advocates in the Oration. Now, the funny thing about this is that there's two ways of looking at Pico's sort of characterization of man as having no fixed nature and as therefore being able to create himself into whatever he wants to be and reach whatever heights he wants to reach, as being almost unlimited in that way. There's a kind of noble, exalted way of looking at it on the one hand, which is the sort of Renaissance man way of looking at it, where you constantly push yourself toward excellence, toward achieving greatness, toward mastery, towards becoming proficient in as many things as you can, towards developing yourself to the greatest possible extent, and just achieving whatever amount of greatness, whatever amount of proficiency, whatever amount of excellence you can. That's one way of looking at it, and that's sort of a noble way, and that very much derived out of Pico's thought. Again, you have this notion of the Renaissance man who masters everything. Now, but the other way of looking at this, and this really leads to the more sort of contemporary degenerate ideas about man and his nature, is that if man can be whatever he wants to be, well, then the door is open for saying anything, no matter how ridiculous. If you go from man has no fixed nature, he is self-creating and can make himself be whatever you want to be, it's not much of a stretch to then say, I sexually identify as an attack helicopter, or or for someone who was born a man to say that they're not really a man. And, so you get all of this social justice warrior stuff from it. And so that derives out of it as well. So you have this kind of noble tradition of pursuit toward excellence, but also this completely diametrically opposed view of just no standards being recognized, no rules being recognized. And these two completely diametrically opposed views of man ultimately come out of Pico's thought, I think. You can trace them back to Pico's view of man as being self-creating. Another thing, if we want to draw another connection, Robert Nozick, the philosopher, and some libertarians may know him because of his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. He wrote on many other philosophical subjects also. Now, in another book he wrote called Philosophical Explanations, he discusses sort of kind of general miscellaneous philosophical subjects, ethics, free will, etc. One of the chapters of that book is devoted to theories of the self and to theories of personal identity. Now, for those who may not know, the philosophy of personal identity is concerned with things like, what is a person? How do we know what the self is? Is there even such a thing? Because there are things about us that we observe. For example, when someone is at the age of, let's say, 70, they don't look like they did when they were 7 anymore. They changed physically. They changed in all sorts of other respects. Their beliefs have changed. Their attitudes have changed. Over the course of a lifetime, or really any period of time for that matter, people can potentially undergo any number of changes. And yet we like to say that that person, despite all those changes they've undergone, is still in some sense the same person. This is actually another re-emergence of the problem of the one and the many. So the question then for the philosophy of personal identity is, what is the person? How can we say that the self persists through all these changes that we observe? What does it mean to say that we have a self, etc.? Now, part of what Nozick says on this is he takes a view of the self, of man, that is almost identical to Pico's view. Now, I don't know whether he derived this from Pico. I don't remember seeing any citations to Pico, so I'm going to say probably not. He probably didn't do that consciously. But if that's the case, then that illustrates something, which is that the sorts of ideas promulgated by the Renaissance, the sort of conception of man as being willing and self-creating that really fully flowered in the Renaissance, has permeated modern thought to such a degree that it's just totally in the air, and that it seems like a natural thing to believe. And this is another kind of point that I want to get across with this whole series in general. There's a lot of things about the ideas that we have today that seem natural, did not always seem natural, and they seem natural and obvious to us today because they derive from a long tradition stretching back hundreds of years. And it's because certain lines of thought within that tradition have so permeated our thinking that things like that seem natural to us. And among those things that seem natural are, this notion of man as self-creating, that you can be whatever you want to be, the notion of there being some kind of inherent dignity to humanity, notions of natural rights, etc. I could go on. That sort of thing. So, so within Pico, you have this idea of sort of humanism and its emphasis on man as being created in the image of God and therefore having great dignity as reaching its highest point in saying that man is ultimately self-creating. Now, Pico does not in this way attempt to dethrone God by giving human will this great power. He says that the reason that humans are self-creating and the reason that they have no fixed nature and they can make themselves be what they want to be is that this capacity is ultimately a divine gift. It's a gift from God. So even for him, God is ultimately at the end of things. So he doesn't abandon Christianity totally, even though it may look that way superficially. Also, with regard to Pico's syncretism and his grandiose attempts to take all the disparate religious and philosophical traditions and reconcile them into one thing, as I mentioned briefly, he tries to do this with his 900 Theses, and he completely fails. And his failure in this regard is sort of emblematic of the more general failure of the kind of project of the Italian Renaissance of trying to reconcile paganism with Christianity by showing that they have this common origin, by fitting all these things together. They basically they try to bite off more than they can chew, because as humanist scholars look more and more deeply into classical literature, they uncovered works from all sorts of different traditions, and they had more and more and more things that they had to synthesize, so the project became increasingly difficult for them. And eventually it just became too difficult. They just bit off more than they could chew, and the whole thing sort of collapsed. And in response to this, a reaction had set in. And so now, among Italian thinkers who once thought that man's will was potentially unlimited, that man had these tremendous capacities, a kind of skepticism had begun to set in. Suddenly, Italian thinkers following Pico were more skeptical about man's capacities, about his ability to gather knowledge, and they preferred to withhold judgment on many things, on things which they could not reach a definitive conclusion. This was really stimulated especially after Cicero's work Academica was republished in 1471 and became widespread. So in the wake of this kind of failure, people began turning to other sectors, other traditions within Italy. So one example of this would be Savonarola, who's kind of a proto-Lutheran sort of preacher. He was this kind of Italian firebrand priest who attacked the church for its excessive wealth and corruption, and also attacked the Medici for the political corruption that they had set in as rulers of Florence. He attacked the Pope, and remember, Alexander VI was the Pope at the time. If any of you have watched the Showtime series from a few years ago, The Borgias, you'll know how corrupt he was. But anyway, this was a horrifically corrupt Pope. Savonarola was a merciless critic of him. He also hated the humanists because he saw them as basically pagans pretending to be Christians, and he thought that was nonsense and that it wasn't genuine Christianity. And in place of this, he preached a more earnest, sort of introspective Christianity that relied on personal faith more, and he was a very, very, very charismatic preacher, and attracted a huge following. He actually became so popular that when the Medici dynasty fell, and the French army sort of swooped in to kind of remove them from power forever, Savonarola established a kind of theocratic republic within Florence that was sort of similar to John Calvin's Geneva. And he ruled over this place from 1494 to his death in 1498. And now Savonarola was eventually taken down because the Pope got too annoyed with all of his criticisms of him and eventually just deprived him of his authority to preach. Now Savonarola's power was an outgrowth completely and entirely of his charisma and of nothing else. So when he came to power, he really made no efforts to solidify his power, and it wasn't difficult to remove him from power once he was deprived of the ability to preach. And he was captured by warring factions within Florence. He was hanged, burned at the stake, executed, and that was the end of him. After that, a man named Piero Soderini came to power, and he was essentially Chancellor of Florence and ruled over Florence. And in the wake of his accession, humanist thought began to take a much more practical turn. Okay, so you have writers like Pico and Ficino who were very focused on these sort of high-minded Platonic ideas of love permeating everything, and how everything is, permeated with the divine essence. This very sort of spiritual, exalted kind of thing that's very much removed from everyday life. And humanism, after Soderini's accession, began to move away from this, in part because of sort of the chaos engendered by Savonarola and the collapse of the Medici, but also because of the failure of the really ambitious syncretism that a lot of these Renaissance thinkers had undertaken to accomplish. So you had skepticism setting in, and you had a more kind of practical turn being taken on. So when you look, for example, at Ficino's successor in that sort of informal group of discussions among humanists that Ficino had started, this was a man named Angelo Poliziano. He took a totally different emphasis from the one that Ficino had taken. Ficino emphasized Platonism and philosophy, and although Poliziano also laid a great emphasis on classical works, he was concerned more with history. So, Tacitus, Livy, Roman sort of historians like that, and also poets. So you study poetry, you study literature, you study history, and relative to those things, he advocated a kind of demotion of philosophy. Now, Poliziano's successor was an even more practically minded man. He was a man named Virgilio, and again, totally practically minded, and he wanted to move away completely from training philosophers in his academy to producing politicians, to producing practically minded men who would go out into the world and who would do things, who would get things done. And so he took that complete sort of practical turn. Now, another person, and who needs to be discussed, someone without whom no discussion of Italian humanism is complete, who totally rejected this notion that you get from Ficino about love permeating everything in the world, of everything being ultimately for the best and motivated toward the good, and also as someone who's sort of eminently practically minded, we have to discuss Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli had an extremely pessimistic view of the world. In many ways, his view of man and his life and existence on earth was similar to that of Petrarch. He accepted nominalism and its ontological individualism, and remember, the consequence of nominalism's ontological individualism, once again, is a kind of chaotic amalgamation of sort of disorganized elements where everything is just in chaos and disorder. He accepted that, but he brought it down to the realm of human affairs. And so he thought human societies were chaotic, greed, ambition, lust for power, all of these passions dominated man and drove him to seek glory and basically to cause chaos. And therefore, great statesmen were necessary in order to establish powerful states and to lay down the law so as to assert social order and prevent things from getting out of hand. That was basically Machiavelli's view. So he thought, therefore, that great statesmen were among the greatest goods that human society could have. Now, another thing that should be said about Machiavelli is, although he sort of, believed in God, he had this kind. He went to mass occasionally. He was not particularly devout, but he was a Christian basically. He believed that God created the world about 40 or 50,000 years ago, and that he had ordered it, but that it was not ordered in the sort of perfect and harmonious way that Ficino had thought. He also thought that God, after creating the world, had sort of left it in human hands, and therefore human society was a totally human creation, according to Machiavelli, And so the business of organizing it was a totally human business, contingent entirely on the human will. So again, you have this notion of statesmen who create order in order to restrain the greedy, and the ambitious and the destructive tendencies inherent in man. And anytime a statesman like this comes along, this is a great thing for Machiavelli. And so, even though it is necessary, Machiavelli thought, for a statesman to do evil things, so he has to kill people, he has to lie, etc., in order to establish his state, the establishment of the state and of the social order that it provides is so important, is such a great good, that God would actually be willing to forgive the statesman for all the evil that he's done, because he's done it in the service of a greater good, and therefore great statesmen, end up in heaven anyway. Machiavelli also thought of kind of four men as four examples of being kind of like heroes, great statesmen. So he had Romulus, the one example, the founder of Rome. He thought of Cyrus, founded the Persian Empire. He thought of Moses, and I believe the last one was Lycurgus, the founder of Sparta. So you have these great men who come in. They impose order upon chaos, and another interesting feature of all of them is that they seem to be self-made. So again, you have this notion of the power of the human will, and of the ability of humans to create themselves and make themselves into what they want to be. And I mean, you still see this notion today, right? How many people have told you can be whatever you want to be? How many stories have been told of self-made businessmen during the Gilded Age who rose from nothing? Your Rockefellers and your Carnegies. This still exists in the air. This is still part of the ethos of America, for example. Well, Machiavelli very much had this idea of someone, being self-made and achieving greatness by way of performing great deeds in the public sphere. He also greatly admired Pico, from whom he got this idea, except that Pico was very kind of ethereal and spiritualistic, and he sort of moved away from that and tried to bring things down to earth. Now, that said, despite Machiavelli's sincere belief in the greatness of human potentialities, he also thought that humans were beset by all sorts of different contingencies, that they would fall victim to fortune, and that there were many things in life which were beyond their control. And he saw this clearly just because of the time period that he lived through. He lived through Savonarola's Republic and the chaos that it caused. Which, by the way, is what led him to the conclusion that mere religious piety and zealotry was not enough. You needed skill to really organize a society. Savonarola was not an effective statesman for all his charisma and for all his religious zeal. So, because humans were beset by fortune, were always at the mercy of fortune, were attacked from all sides by any number of things that were outside their control, even the greatest, even the most skilled man can only succeed, according to Machiavelli, about half the time. Nevertheless, he must do battle against fate, he must do battle against fortune, and because this is what is necessary to create a functioning, stable human societies. So, again, anyone who could accomplish this was, in Machiavelli's view, a great man. So, the interesting thing here is that in Machiavelli, you have, on the one hand, this emphasis on the power of the human will, of the ability of people to be self-made, self-creators, to achieve great deeds, and yet also an acknowledgement that they are constrained by fortune. But you also have this emphasis on practical action. So, great deeds of great statesmanship. This emphasis on martial virtue, on military values especially. Machiavelli was very big on this. Now, I mentioned in the end of my last video on Petrarch that I would offer a kind of brief discussion of how something like fascism eventually emerged out of the the ethos and the thought of the Italian Renaissance and how fascist ideas owed their genesis to that. And here you can see that, because in fascism, especially in Italy, you have this great emphasis on martial virtue. You have these militaristic images, strong statesmen, these very kind of alpha male guys just going out into politics and just getting things done. Um, that's very much a part of the imagery of fascism. And you see that derived from the strong emphasis of the Italian humanists on the power of the human will and on Machiavelli's focus on practical action in particular. You also see among fascists basically the belief that politics itself is just a matter of will. They don't really acknowledge the existence of, let's say, economic law that could hinder what you do. So you can't just set whatever arbitrary price you want on goods, because the price system will react and you'll either get shortages or gluts depending on where you set the price. And that these are just natural reactions of an economy that a state, no matter how powerful, cannot really fully counteract. Fascists kind of rejected this. They saw political planning and economic planning as being just totally a matter of will. If you really want to get something done, they thought, you can get it done. You just need to crack enough skulls. Right? And that, again, is based on this humanist emphasis on the power of the will. So that's where that comes from. So, I mean, that's basically Italian humanism for you. You have this strong emphasis on man as having been created in the image of God, which leads to this Promethean concept of the human will. Now, of course, the church reacts to this very strongly. And in particular, Pico was condemned because he went way beyond the bounds of anything that was considered acceptable for Christian orthodoxy, despite the fact that he still considered himself Christian. In fact, what's interesting is that whenever Pico came to a situation in which he tried to reconcile two religious traditions or two different philosophical ideas, and he couldn't, he always fell back on Scripture. So, that's interesting. So he believed that although philosophy could take you far, it could only take you so far, and he ultimately fell back on religious revelation. But still, the seeds were planted, and there was this enormously powerful emphasis on what the human will could do. Now, when this grand syncretistic project of trying to reconcile every philosophical system and every religious tradition together failed, as I said, many people retreated backwards into skepticism. They tried to moderate their views. And this is the sort of milieu out of which we get the Northern Renaissance, and Northern Humanism. Now, because of various differences that northern countries like the Netherlands had with Italy, the strong emphasis on the will that existed within Italian humanism was never there within the northern tradition. The northern tradition was much more moderate, much more skeptical, much more reliant on those church fathers who had used scripture rather than philosophy to do their philosophical work and so on. But it did nevertheless offer a place for human will, and enough of a place that some people did try to accuse northern humanists like Erasmus of Pelagianism. Now, before going into detail about Erasmus's work, though, there is one other thing to understand about the origins of northern humanism. There was a religious movement that emerged in the Netherlands, but that then spread to Poland and Germany and a few other countries, that was known as the Devotio Moderna. And this came about really in sort of the mid-14th century and grew as things went on, and really had a great influence in the north, and particularly influenced Erasmus. Now, the Devotio Moderna was founded by a man named Geert Groote. I know that pronunciation sounds terrible, but he's Dutch, Actually, if you look in Gillespie's book, the first name he's given is Gerard, which is sort of the anglicization of the Dutch name. I'm using the Dutch name. And if any of you try to sort of Google him, and based on my pronunciation of the name are not able to find him, it's because in Dutch, G's are pronounced like thick H's. So his first name, Geert, like the Dutch politician, the anti-immigration politician, Geert Wilders, same name as him. Anyway, so Geert Grote founded this group, and it emphasized sincere, deep, inner religious conviction over a kind of bland, overly ostentatious ceremonialism. So the thinking was that it was more important to be inwardly, sincerely convinced of Christianity, of the divinity of Christ, and then to imitate Christ's life by being loving, by being charitable, and so on, than it was to participate in all of these fancy ceremonies that the church hierarchy had developed. These were sort of window dressing, according to this view, just kind of useless fripperies, bells and whistles that contributed nothing essential. And Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus, the kind of main figure of the Northern Renaissance that I want to discuss, was heavily influenced by this tradition. Now, he, like many of the other humanists, including those in Italy, emphasized the classics and an education in languages, in rhetoric, in things like that. But he never went to the sort of extremes that the Italian humanists went to in their emphases on the power of the human will. Now, what's interesting about Northern humanism relative to the Italian sort is that, as I think I mentioned earlier, Italian humanism was attractive to intellectuals. It was attractive to the elite precisely because of how elitist it was. If you have the capacity within you to truly become a Renaissance man, you're going to be attracted to a system of thought that promotes that kind of striving and that kind of excellence. Northern humanism was much more humble, and it talked about the need for sincere, inner, spiritual belief in Christian purity, an imitation of the life of Christ, and then also of the need to reform the church in a way that would curb institutional abuses like the sale of indulgences, for example. By the way, this is actually what led Erasmus into some opposition to nominalism, because even though he accepted some parts of nominalism, rather unthinkingly really, because he wasn't terribly interested in metaphysics, so he accepted some parts of nominalism like ontological individualism. He also thought that the nominalists' emphasis on divine omnipotence really kind of led people either into a kind of quietism where they just didn't care and therefore did not strive to be good people, or to just a total wild abandon where they just did whatever they wanted to do and said, who cares how I live in this life, God will do what he will do, and I'll either be saved or I won't be, so I might as well enjoy myself now. He wanted to avoid both of these extremes, and so he rejected the nominalist emphasis on divine will above all else, but it's actually this nominalist emphasis on divine will above all else that led to the sale of indulgences being prominent within the church, because the idea was if you pay the church and you buy an indulgence, you can get yourself a place in heaven and sort of ingratiate yourself with God. Not really totally consistent, because it's supposed to ultimately be God's decision anyway on this line of thought, but that's how it kind of evolved, weirdly. So, because Northern humanism was much more moderate, and because it criticized the church by making reference to ideals of charity that the church at least nominally shared, it was ultimately much more dangerous to the church hierarchy than Italian humanism was. And it also, because it was so much more humble and moderate, had a much broader appeal. This made it a lot more dangerous. And, of course, naturally, the church began acting to crack down on a lot of the northern humanists within this tradition. A prominent example is a thinker named Johannes Reuchlin, who introduced Hebrew, the teaching of Hebrew, into German academic life, Pope Leo X moved to condemn him. A lot of prominent humanists rose in his defense. And eventually, because of all of these people rising to defend Reuchlin, the Pope backed off. And that seemed to be like a great victory for humanism, but the battle lines had basically been drawn, and when the next generation came along, the next generation of humanists, that being Erasmus's generation, the stage was set for a conflict. And that sort of grew and grew and grew until it ultimately culminated in the Protestant Reformation. Now, about Erasmus. So, Desiderius Erasmus was born in Rotterdam in 1466. He was the illegitimate son of a man named Roger Gerard, who eventually went on to become a priest. And then his mother's name was Margaret. A last name is not given. I just looked in the book and all it says is Margaret. I don't know anything else about her, except that she was a physician's daughter. So, Erasmus was given a relatively standard education, and then after his parents died, he was sent into an Augustinian monastery, where he remained until 1492. And basically, because of his experience in that monastery, he had developed a lifelong hatred for monks. He was treated extremely harshly while he was there, and never liked monks afterwards. But as he lived there, he eventually began to acquaint himself with humanist thought, Giovanni Boccaccio, Petrarch, Valla, people like that. He began reading their work and began immersing himself within humanism. He had also, in 1494, gone on to write a book called Against the Barbarians, in which he opposed a lot of what many monks had been saying, and said that an education in the classics should be encouraged, because it promoted virtue and so on. So he also retained this humanist idea of Christian piety and Roman virtue both being important. However, again, unlike the Italians, he was much more moderate in his views on this topic. So, after leaving the Augustinian monastery, he went to Paris for a bit, and he studied in Paris until 1499. While he was there, he heard Scotist lectures of all sorts. He wrote a few of his more important works. I just mentioned Against the Barbarians, for example, and he sort of developed that way. Then, in 1499, after completing all of that, he went to England for a short time, and he stayed in Oxford. While he was there, he came into contact with another humanist named John Colet. Colet then basically taught him to despise the nominalist emphasis on divine omnipotence above all other things, for the reasons that I described, that they either led people to adopt a life of wild abandon or total quietism, and that this would therefore undermine attempts to be virtuous and moral. So he also met Thomas More, with whom he remained friends for the rest of More's life. More was executed in 1535. After that, he returned to Paris, where he remained from 1500 to 1506, and there he wrote a number of his other more important works, among them being his Handbook of a Christian Soldier, in which he began really talking about things in line with the thought of the Devotio Moderna, that emphasis on a simple religious piety that is not clouded by all sorts of abstruse metaphysical speculations, something that could appeal to the simple common man and inspire genuine religious feeling in him, and that genuine, sincere religious feeling was more important than kind of bland, showy, ostentatious ceremonialism. He said all of these things, and he also began to emphasize Christ's humanness, his humanity, as opposed to emphasizing his role as the first priest, because remember there's a lot of there's an anti-clerical strain within his thought because he writes against this kind of liturgical ceremonialism, and also as against an emphasis on Christ as sacrificial victim. So he emphasized Christ's humanity in order to again bring religion down to earth some more, and to emphasize that one had to be simple and pious in one's religious convictions. Then, from 1506 to 1509, he lived in Italy, at which point he became a tutor to the illegitimate son of James IV of Scotland. While living in Italy, he also visited Florence and Rome, and while he spent time in Florence, he appears to have been so absorbed in his work that even though men like Leonardo, Michelangelo, Machiavelli, etc., even though they all lived in Florence at the time that Erasmus was there, he apparently never found time to meet with them. He could have, but he just never did. So then, later on, he sort of began producing more and more of his works, and as he was leaving Italy, he wrote his famous satire in praise of folly, which sort of made fun of monks. It satirized political institutions, and within works like this, we see something within Erasmus's thought. He had, as I said, a deep aversion to metaphysics, so he thought that the scholastics engaged in what he termed higher lunacy, these abstract metaphysical debates that really had no connection to anything and that really couldn't inspire genuine virtue among common people. And he also hated the nominalists for their terminological squabbles. So he thought this was all nonsense. And he said that the way to win people over to your side is not to engage them in philosophical debate, but to employ rhetoric, to use humor to win them over and to illustrate your points. And this is something that any kind of aspiring movement can take a lesson from. Libertarians tend to jump into philosophical debates about the non-aggression principle and property rights and so on. And this isn't going to appeal to a lot of people. That's just to use one example. Or let's look at the alt-right recently with all of their hilarious Trump memes. I mean, I'm sure that that's gotten a lot of people who may not have been previously interested in Donald Trump to take an interest in him. So there's that interesting emphasis on rhetoric as opposed to philosophical argument, on satire, and so on. Now, moving on, by 1514, Erasmus's reputation had basically been established. He had been given the sobriquet, the Prince of the Humanists, for all of his, great and wonderful works. And he'd emphasized again that a Christian should be pious, should be sincere in his religious convictions, and also he emphasized pacifism, because you had to imitate the life of Christ, and Christ was very peaceful. Now, also, his emphasis on pacifism may have had something to do with his own personal cowardice. There's a letter quoted in Gillespie's book where Erasmus basically says to someone that he's writing to that, if the Pope or the King demands that I do something, I will obey because it is their will, and when their will is unjust, I will tolerate it because I'm not the sort of man who would be willing to lay down my life for an idea. So his pacifism may have been influenced at least partly by his own personal lack of courage, but it does nevertheless show a striking contrast with the Italian emphasis on martial virtue, on, sort of prowess in war, and that kind of striving to achieve greatness. Then, also, he would later become an advisor to Prince Charles of Spain in 1515. The following year, in 1516, Charles would become King of Spain, and then in 1519 he would become the Holy Roman Emperor. And Erasmus would move to be closer to the court in Brussels so that he could be around the emperor and advise him. He wrote, for example, another one of his works called The Education of a Christian Prince in the effort to do this. And that had sort of been the way his life was going until by 1521, life at the court became increasingly difficult for him. The Protestant Reformation had begun a few years before, and people had been looking upon Erasmus with suspicion. They thought that he was secretly a sympathizer of Luther's because of all of his criticisms of the church and clericalism. Now, he really wasn't. He wanted to reform the church, but he didn't want to do it in the sweeping, violent, revolutionary kind of way that Luther had done it. He wanted to do it in a more moderate way. This is in keeping with just kind of his general sort of moderate temperament and the whole moderate line of emphasis within Northern humanism. The way that he wanted to inaugurate reform was through a gradual process of education in classical rhetoric, in classical literature, in sort of humanistic studies, and then to get these classically trained humanists into various positions of influence where they could, influence policy and bring about the sort of reforms of the church that, and of society and of states that Erasmus had wanted to see. Also, unlike Luther, Erasmus did not believe that the problem with the church lay in doctrinal issues. He didn't really have a problem with any of the doctrinal beliefs of the Catholic Church. He thought that the problems of the church that existed were institutional. So the clergy was corrupted by wealth, the clergy was corrupted by temporal power, that sort of thing. And so institutional change, not necessarily doctrinal change, was what Erasmus believed was needed. Now, because he wanted to bring about this gradual process of change, and because he was so influential and respected among humanists, things were really beginning to look up for Erasmus. In the years just before Luther had posted his 95 Theses, just before 1517, when the Protestant Reformation had begun, things were looking good. It was looking as though Erasmus might actually be getting what he wanted. He had many friends in high places, people that he had influenced. Thomas More was a friend of his who greatly admired him, who was an advisor to King Henry VIII of England. One of his students eventually became Pope Adrian VI. So it was looking like Erasmus was standing on the cusp of a golden age where that strategy of getting people who had been educated the right way, it's a kind of Fabian humanism almost, or sort of Frankfurt School style approach to this, really. It looked like this had been working. But the thing that had shattered all of this was the Reformation. Now, what Erasmus wanted his sort of style of humanists to be educated in was his Philosophia Christi, his philosophy of Christ. And in keeping with humanism in general, this was a way of reading and understanding Scripture that was very focused on language, on rhetoric, and so on. And he believed that God had proclaimed himself through all languages. Because again, like Valla, he thought that because all thought was conducted within language, all thinking was therefore necessarily rhetorical. And so training in rhetoric was absolutely necessary to anyone who wanted to be a thinker in anything. And he saw this as being important in all religions, but especially in Christianity. Because remember, John verse 1, chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right? So in Christianity, you have this thing where God communicates to man by way of the Word. And so an understanding of language was a sine qua non. You couldn't do without it, according to Erasmus. He also believed, and this is actually, Gillespie doesn't say this, but this is actually quite interestingly in keeping with something that many of the early church fathers, people like Oration and Irenaeus, believed in, which is that when one interprets Scripture and one attempts to reconcile two seemingly contradictory passages, one should do this, one should employ one's efforts to do this within the context of a larger discourse among other Christians. So basically, the way that these contradictions are hammered out and solved is by discussion with other Christians, so that by way of these conversations, the Christian community can reach a kind of consensus. So it was this very humanistically based, rhetorically based study of Scripture, which he then combined with the humble notion of religion that was received from the Devotio Moderna, that emphasized an imitation of the life of Christ, living humbly, living with charity, not pursuing glory, and also of having deep inner religious conviction, as that being more important than the outward displays of religious ceremony. Okay, now that was quite long. That was quite detailed, but that really describes humanism in both its aspects. That's really all I have to say there. But as I said, although Erasmus thought that he was on the cusp of a golden age, of bringing about the sorts of gradual reforms that he wanted by getting his people into the right positions of influence, Luther had come in and smashed this all to pieces. And in the next video, I will be discussing Martin Luther, and in discussing Martin Luther, I will show that unlike humanism, which decided to emphasize the primacy of man on the question of the relationship between man, God, and nature, unlike humanism, the Reformation, Protestantism, emphasized God and God's importance. So you get this kind of fideistic, irrational, or at least irrational, in some cases even anti-rational religious fervor that emerges out of Protestantism, and that in relation to God, man becomes like an insect, his will is almost nothing, everything becomes ultimately contingent on God, and so from that you get Calvinism, various sorts of theological fatalism, and so on. But also, what I'll probably be discussing in the video on Luther and Protestantism is Islam, because similar developments occurring at different times, but similar developments to what had been going on in Christianity with the nominalist revolution, then leading to the Reformation, which had this very non-rational take on theology. Similar things had been happening in Islam as well, because earlier Islamic philosophers like Averroes were sort of very rationalistic and so on, but people like him did not ultimately win the day in Islam. The people that won the day were people like Al-Ghazali, who emphasized just reading the Quran and religious faith above philosophy and reason, and that ultimately influenced movements like Wahhabism, and that produced the sort of crazed, violent, sort of fundamentalist Islam that we see today moving into the West, making incursions on the West. I want to discuss not only Protestantism then, but also Islam, because parallel developments have been happening there, and sort of tie all this together and try to shed some light on where this conflict between the Western world and the Islamic world has its origin. Now, yes, American foreign policy also factors into it. There's blowback, there's those things. I don't deny it. I don't deny that. But there's also this theological origin of a kind of similar tradition within Islam, which emphasizes theological voluntarism, divine will, as opposed to anything else. And that is what produced the Islamic fundamentalists that we now see. Now, could the Islamic world have gone a different way if Islamic philosophers like Averroes had had their way instead of others? I don't know. It's an interesting question. But it's something that I will go into in the next video. And then, also after that, once Luther has been discussed, it will be very important to discuss the debate, and this will be in a video even after that, the debate between Luther and Erasmus on the question of free will, and how that debate is emblematic of the clash between the Reformation and humanism, and the ultimate irreconcilability of these two views, one of which emphasized man, the other of which emphasized God. And since these two views could not be reconciled, what then became necessary for subsequent thinkers was to emphasize and give primacy to not man or God, but nature in the relation of, in the question of how man, God, and nature relate to each other. So, and by giving nature primacy, you then get scientific naturalism and all of these sorts of other things. So that's it. This is very long. I hope this was informative, though. I hope it was enlightening. Thank you for listening. More to come.